Learning Module, Fiscal Policy. Topic, Introduction to Monetary and Fiscal Policy. Macroeconomic stabilization policies, including fiscal and monetary policy, primarily aim to A. Achieve high economic growth while maintaining price stability. B. Redistribute income from higher to lower income households. C. Reduce trade imbalances through currency depreciation. Which of the following statements best describes fiscal policy? It seeks to influence the macroeconomy by managing the nation's money supply and interest rates. B. Involves the manipulation by the government of its taxation and spending levels. C. Is primarily conducted by an independent central bank to achieve price stability. Which of the following actions is least likely to be classified as a monetary policy measure? A central bank raises its policy interest rate to control inflation. B. A government announces an increase in income taxes to reduce the budget deficit. C. A central bank purchases government securities to inject liquidity into the banking system. The overarching goal of stabilization policy: creating an economic environment in which growth is stable and positive, and inflation is stable and low, by actively managing the business cycle to moderate growth when an economy overheats and accelerate it when it slows. While fiscal policy can be used to redistribute income and wealth, its overriding goal is to influence a broader range of economic activity. Furthermore, ensuring the stability of the purchasing power of a currency is specifically a goal of monetary policy rather than fiscal policy, confirming that maintaining a path of positive, stable growth with low inflation is the primary and unifying goal of stabilization. The defining characteristic of fiscal policy is that it is driven by the government through decisions on taxation and spending. These tools are manipulated specifically to affect aggregate demand and the overall level of economic activity. Monetary policy is the domain of central banks, whereas fiscal policy is the domain of the government. Managing the quantity of money, credit, and interest rates is explicitly defined as monetary policy, not fiscal policy. While both share the goal of stable growth and low inflation, price stability, such as maintaining the purchasing power of the currency, is a primary responsibility of monetary policy. Option B is a government decision regarding taxation, a fiscal tool, rather than a central bank activity directed toward the quantity of money. Monetary policy refers to central bank activities that are directed toward influencing the quantity of money and credit in an economy. Its overarching goal is the creation of an economic environment in which growth is stable and positive, and inflation is stable and low. Fiscal policy refers to the government's decisions about taxation and spending. It involves using government spending and tax revenue to affect the overall level of aggregate demand, the distribution of income and wealth among different segments of the population, and the allocation of resources between different sectors. Fiscal policy refers to the government's decisions about taxation and spending. It involves using government spending and tax revenue to affect the overall level of aggregate demand, the distribution of income and wealth among different segments of the population, and the allocation of resources between different sectors. Topic: Roles and objectives of fiscal policy. A government decides to increase corporate tax rates while reducing subsidies for renewable energy projects. This policy is most likely A. An expansionary fiscal policy. B. A contractionary fiscal policy. See an example of monetary easing. A high level of public debt is most likely to be sustainable if the funds are used primarily to finance current government consumption, such as public sector wages. B. A large proportion of the debt is denominated in a foreign currency, and the country's exports are declining. C. The debt is financing public investment in infrastructure and education that promotes long-term economic growth. Which of the following is the most likely adverse consequence of persistently high public debt levels in an economy? A. Reduced investor confidence leading to higher borrowing costs. B. Increased household consumption, driven by higher government spending. C. Enhanced economic growth through sustained fiscal stimulus. Under which of the following conditions is the crowding out effect least likely to occur following an increase in government spending? A. The economy is operating at full capacity with high interest rates. B. The central bank maintains tight monetary policy to control inflation. C. The economy is in a deep recession with significant unused productive capacity. The crowding out effect is most likely to occur when A. The government reduces its budget deficit by cutting spending. B. The central bank increases the money supply to lower interest rates. C. The government increases borrowing to finance a fiscal stimulus. According to the Ricardian equivalence principle, an increase in government borrowing to finance a tax cut will most likely result in a higher consumer spending because households feel wealthier. B. No change in overall demand because households increase saving in anticipation of future taxes. C. Lower national saving because government deficits always reduce private saving. In boom times or to manage a budget, reducing government spending, such as subsidies, and raising taxes are the two primary actions that define a contractionary fiscal policy. Corporate taxes and subsidies for specific sectors, like alternative energy, are explicitly listed as fiscal tools used to influence business profits, resource allocation, and aggregate demand. The most critical distinction is the decision maker. Decisions regarding taxation and subsidies are the sole domain of the government. Fiscal policy, while easing or managing the money supply, is the domain of a central bank. Monetary policy. An expansionary stance is the functional opposite of the scenario described, as it would involve cutting taxes or increasing spending to accelerate growth. Public debt is most sustainable when it funds capital investment projects, such as infrastructure, or enhances human capital, such as education or training, as these directly increase the economy's productive potential. The key to sustainability is that real economic growth leads to higher real tax revenues, allowing the government to service the debt at constant tax rate levels. E. The difference between capital and current government spending, wages, or social services. The latter is for recurring consumption and does not add to the nation's capital stock. B. While the sources do not explicitly discuss foreign currency, they emphasize that debt becomes unsustainable if the real interest rate on the debt is higher than the real growth rate of the economy. Stability is lost if investors lose confidence, causing financing costs to escalate rapidly. If investors lose confidence in a government's ability to honor its debt, financing costs, interest rates can escalate rapidly, making the economic situation unstable. Crowding out effect is where large government demands for borrowing led to higher interest rates and lower private sector investment. B. Households may increase saving rather than consumption if they anticipate that current debt-funded spending must be repaid through higher future taxes. This is Ricardian equivalence. C. High debt to GDP levels are associated with higher tax rates, which create disincentives to economic activity, such as labor effort and entrepreneurship, and lead to lower long-term growth. When an economy has considerable unemployment or idle factories, government spending does not divert activity away from productive uses. In a recession, fiscal stimulus works more effectively because the government is not yet competing for a limited pool of savings, which is the primary driver of crowding out. Fiscal expansions have their greatest impact on aggregate output when there is significant unemployment, whereas they have little impact near full employment. Crowding out is defined by government borrowing causing higher interest rates, which subsequently lowers private sector investing. A. At full employment, there are few spare unused resources. Therefore, increased spending cannot raise output and instead creates upward pressure on prices, inflation. B. When the government competes with the private sector for a limited amount of savings, it directly reduces the ability of private firms to access investment funds. The primary driver of crowding out is that government borrowing competes with the private sector for a limited pool of savings. This competition results in higher interest rates, which directly reduces the ability of the private sector to access investment funds and lowers private sector investing. Crowding out as a consequence of fiscal policy borrowing. In contrast, monetary policy, option B, involves central bank activities directed toward the quantity of money and credit is used as a separate tool to regulate economic activity. Because crowding out is triggered by additional borrowing to fund a fiscal deficit, a policy that reduces spending to cut the deficit, option A, would decrease the competition for funds rather than cause crowding out. The defining feature of Ricardian equivalence is that the private sector offsets the government deficit by increasing saving in anticipation of higher future taxes. For this principle to hold, households must see debt finance tax cuts as delayed taxation, rather than an increase in wealth. The theory hinges on the idea that these actions result in no net impact on aggregate demand, because the change in private behavior exactly neutralizes the government's fiscal stance. Topic: Fiscal policy tools. If a government enacts a stimulus package that simultaneously increases spending on public infrastructure and increases taxes by the same amount, the most likely immediate effect on aggregate demand is a decrease, because higher taxes always discourage economic activity more than spending encourages it. B, an increase due to the balanced budget multiplier effect. C, no net change, because the fiscal actions perfectly offset each other. In a hypothetical economy, households consume 50% of their disposable income, and the marginal tax rate is 25% of total income. If the government decides to reduce spending by $2 billion, the decrease in total income and spending in billions is closest to A, $3.2, B, $5.0, C, $1.6. A primary disadvantage of using direct government spending, as opposed to tax cuts, as a fiscal stimulus is that spending has a smaller multiplier effect on aggregate demand. B is subject to longer implementation lags. C provides less certainty to households and firms. MPC is less than 1. Because people save a portion of their income, a tax increase reduces consumption by less than the full amount of the tax, allowing the equal increase in government spending to create a net boost. The balanced budget multiplier is mathematically defined as unity, 1.0, which confirms that output rises by exactly the amount of the additional government spending. Fiscal policy influences aggregate demand through both G and T, but because the spending multiplier is more potent than the tax multiplier, a balanced budget expansion is net expansionary. The most critical part is the specific fiscal multiplier formula, which accounts for leakages from the economy in the form of both taxes and savings. Marginal propensity to consumed, MPC of 0.5, must be applied to disposable income, 1 minus T, rather than total income. This results in an effective consumption rate of 0.375 out of every dollar of total national income. The calculation of 1.6 is the multiplier, which defines the ratio of the change in equilibrium output to the change in autonomous spending. It shows that a $2 billion cut results in a total income reduction of $3.2 billion. This process illustrates contractionary fiscal policy, where a reduction in government spending is used to influence the overall level of aggregate demand and economic activity. Marginal tax rate, T, acts as an automatic stabilizer. By creating an additional leakage, it reduces the size of the multiplier and dampens the economy's response to the spending cut. The primary disadvantage of direct spending, specifically capital expenditure, is that it is slow to plan, implement, and execute. 3 specific delays identified. The recognition lag, such as identifying the need; the action lag includes deciding and planning; and the impact lag, which is the time for the activity to be felt in the economy. Stabilization risk. Because these tools take years to formulate, the eventual impact may occur after the economic conditions have already changed. Direct government spending has a far bigger impact on aggregate spending than tax cuts. While spending adds to aggregate demand directly, the impact of a tax cut is reduced by the proportion households choose to save, the marginal propensity to save. In a recession, tax cuts may fail to boost demand if consumers choose to increase precautionary saving in anticipation of a worsening economy. While spending is slower to implement, it provides a direct injection into the economy, whereas the success of tax cuts relies on the uncertain consumption decisions of households. Topic: Fiscal policy implementation. Which of the following best describes the crowding out effect in fiscal policy? When increased government spending leads to higher inflation, reducing consumer purchasing power. B. When government borrowing raises interest rates, discouraging private sector investment. C. When tax cuts boost disposable income, leading to greater private consumption. Which of the following fiscal actions would most likely indicate an expansionary fiscal policy? An increase in income tax rates and a freeze on public sector wages. B. A rise in government infrastructure spending financed by higher borrowing. C. A reduction in unemployment benefits combined with an increase in indirect taxes. Which of the following statements about budget deficits and fiscal policy is most accurate? A rising actual budget deficit always signals an expansionary shift in fiscal policy. B. The structural budget deficit is a better measure of the government's discretionary fiscal stance than the actual deficit. C. A period of strong economic growth that reduces the actual budget deficit is an example of contractionary fiscal policy. Under which of the following conditions is an increase in the budget deficit least likely to be considered an expansionary fiscal policy? A. The deficit increase is driven by a new public works program during a period of high unemployment. B. The deficit increase is caused by a deep recession that automatically reduces tax revenues. C. The deficit increase results from a legislated tax cut aimed at stimulating consumer spending. Which of the following is least likely to explain why fiscal policy is an imperfect tool for stabilizing the economy? Fiscal policy changes are enacted and take effect with long time lags. B. Households and firms may alter their spending behavior in response to policy changes. C. Fiscal authorities can implement tax and spending changes almost immediately when conditions change. The defining feature of crowding out is that government borrowing competes for a limited pool of savings, which raises interest rates and blocks the private sector's access to investment funds. While inflation, option A, and tax-led growth, option C, are related to fiscal policy, crowding out is strictly about the competition for capital that results in lower private sector investing. The key is the link between increased borrowing and the reduction of private investment, which the curriculum identifies as a major argument against high national debt levels. The defining feature of expansionary policy is the use of capital expenditure, such as infrastructure, to directly boost aggregate demand and the association of a rising budget deficit with an increase in economic stimulus. Raising taxes, direct or indirect, and cutting spending. whether through wage freezes or reducing transfer payments, like unemployment benefits, are the standard tools for a contractionary stance aimed at slowing economic activity. An increase in borrowing to fund spending marks a policy as looser or expansionary, whereas tax hikes and spending cuts mark it as tighter or contractionary. Structural or cyclically adjusted budget deficit is the preferred indicator because it represents the deficit that would exist if the economy were at full employment. By using a full employment baseline, this measure removes the noise of automatic stabilizers, making it a better reflection of discretionary fiscal policy, such as intentional government actions. A rising actual deficit is not a reliable signal of expansionary policy because it can increase automatically during a recession due to lower tax receipts and higher transfer payments, without any new policy decision. Similarly, a shrinking deficit during a boom is often a cyclical result of higher tax revenues and lower welfare needs, known as automatic stabilizers, rather than a deliberate contractionary shift in policy. Automatic stabilizers are considered highly effective for stabilization because they do not require policymakers to identify a shock or decide on a response. They function immediately. Automatic stabilizers, like recession-driven tax drops, reduce economic volatility without requiring a policy decision. Therefore, they do not represent an expansionary fiscal stance. Expansionary policy is defined by intentional manipulation of government spending or tax revenue to accelerate growth or influence aggregate demand. The actual deficit can be a misleading indicator. Analysts prefer the structural budget deficit because it isolates intentional policy changes from cyclical economic fluctuations. Fiscal policy cannot stabilize demand completely because of execution difficulties, specifically the lack of immediate action. Fiscal changes, especially capital spending, are slow to plan, implement, and execute. The specific terminology used to describe why fiscal policy is imperfect: the recognition lag identifying the problem, the action lag deciding and planning, and the impact lag the time for the effect to be felt. Private behavior can explicitly offset fiscal goals through Ricardian equivalence, where individuals increase saving to pay for future taxes, or crowding out, where government borrowing reduces the private sector's access to investment funds. Because policymakers are driving while looking in the rearview mirror due to lagging data, fiscal measures are often poorly calibrated to the current economic state.